Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Scientists say they now know what our oldest known ancestor looked like. And it's something of a surprise. They believe that so-called Cheddar Man, a 10,000-year-old skeleton, has skin that was dark to black and blue eyes. Researchers were able to sequence his genome for the first time to establish aspects of his appearance. He was discovered in Cheddar Gorge in Somerset, and John Kay is there for us now. And John, this is not what scientists expected to find.
It's not, and those scientists and people around here, Fiona, are very excited indeed, because for 10,000 years, Cheddar Man lay undisturbed, undiscovered in this cave beneath Cheddar Gorge. And this replica is how we've tended to think of him, as a skeleton, as a pile of bones. But now we can see him almost as a real-life human being.
1, 2, 3, bye-bye!
Putting flesh on his bones. The face of Cheddar Man finally revealed. By extracting his DNA and scanning his skull, experts say they've created him in unprecedented detail. And he looks very different from what they were expecting.
The hair, the eyes, the face, that combination of blue eyes and dark skin, really very striking, something we wouldn't have imagined. And to also get from the DNA, details of his biology, the fact that he couldn't digest milk as an adult. That's something that came really with the advent of farming, and 10,000 years ago people in Britain didn't have that.
Look how he's changed. This is what scientists used to think he looked like, a reconstruction from 20 years ago when DNA analysis was nowhere near as developed.
Cheddar Man and I share a common female relative.
This is modern-day Cheddar Man. Adrian Target lives in the same village and shares DNA with the skeleton found in the gorge. So, time to meet his ancestor.
Do you want to see your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather? Okay, here he comes. And...
Oh, fine.
What do you think?
It's remarkable, isn't it? I think there is probably some resemblance. But yes, I think that's. I think there are certainly other members in my family who he bears a resemblance to. Yes, some of my cousins. Yes.
You can see that in there.
Yeah. Yes. I think my eyes are blue. So perhaps I'll survive.
Let's have a look. They are blue.
Yes, they are blue. His hair's not quite as grey as mine is, or my beard.
So, 10,000 years after he died, 100 years after he was found, finally a face to fit the name of Adrian's ancestor. John Kay, BBC News, Cheddar in Somerset.
Now, 10,000 years ago, Britons would have been black, according to groundbreaking genome analysis. A team from London's Natural History Museum carried out DNA tests on the Stone Age Cheddar Man, Britain's oldest near-complete human skeleton. Scientists then used the data to complete a facial reconstruction, with surprising for some results, as our science editor Tom Clark reports.
He was found in Goff's Cave in Cheddar Gorge in Somerset in 1903. Cheddar Man has long been believed to be the oldest known complete skeleton from a time when humans came to live in Britain permanently. And it's long been assumed he's as white as cheddar. Here's a previous reconstruction of his face. But now Cheddar Man's DNA has revealed he looked very different indeed. That's right, the first resident Britons were black, with blue eyes and wavy hair.
Researchers had an inkling that our ancestors were darker skinned than we were, but they had no idea that some of them could be this dark. And for those of us who identify as being white British, it's now reasonable to ask, well, what does that actually mean, given at least 10% of our ancestry is shared with this group of people?
With Cheddar Man, actually, this part of the skull is still intact. What we did, this part is more broken away, so we were able to go in through here.
The base of his spine.
Yeah, and drill a very tiny hole.
A documentary due to be broadcast next Sunday followed Dr. Brace and colleagues at the Natural History Museum in London as they used the latest DNA techniques to obtain a sample from the bone around the inner ear of Cheddar Man's skull. They managed to extract nearly his entire genetic code and all the details that contains, like skin and eye colour.
It was a surprise just how dark the pigmentation is for Cheddar Man. This was actually incredibly dark-skinned, so it's really interesting for us as scientists to sort of be pinpointing when these kind of things happened. But what we've actually seen is that these darker pigmentations were actually surviving in these colder climes for a lot longer than we had anticipated, probably to do with diet.
Cheddar Man's ancestors left Africa about 40,000 years ago. At this time, much of northern Europe, including Britain, was being covered in ice. Around 10,000 years ago, the ice retreated, but what we now call Britain was connected to the continent by a land bridge called Doggerland. It was across that Cheddar Man's ancestors colonised Britain. There's been people here ever since. We now know Cheddar Man belonged to a group called the Western Hunter-Gatherers, who arrived here before Neolithic people brought farming to Britain about 6,000 years ago.
1, 2, 3, come on!
The new data allowed Dutch twins Arie and Alphonse Kennis to reconstruct Cheddar Man's face.
Years ago we made reconstruction, we know nothing about skin color and things, but now with this new DNA evidence, eye color, skin color, hair color, we get some extra evidence how it would look like. And it's amazingly prominent skin color, hairstyle.
For the scientists, the trove of information in Cheddar Man's DNA makes the colour of his skin kind of superficial.
It can tell us about their lifestyle as well. It can tell us that they do not have the genes that allow you to process drinking milk. They also probably wouldn't have been, well, Cheddar Man probably wouldn't have been able to tolerate any kind of alcohol. So we can tell all sorts of things about lifestyle as well.
The researchers are now extracting DNA from hundreds of human remains from before and after Cheddar Man's death 10,000 years ago. They hope to construct the most complete picture yet of our recent ancestors.
Tom Clark, well, with me now, the historian Subhadra Das, Museum Curator of Science and Medicine at University College London Collections, and the journalist and author Afua Hirsch. Subhadra Das, what was your first reaction?
I have to admit, I'm not proud of my first reaction when I saw the model. I immediately thought catfish. But in terms of an initial reaction, this is a really exciting model to see.
But you weren't surprised, presumably?
Not at all, no. In terms of the skin colour, no, not at all.
Afua?
I wasn't surprised in the sense that I am very aware that the race in this country is fluid and that there are lots of patterns and waves of immigration stretching back thousands of years. But to see Cheddar Man with his dark skin, it definitely provoked quite an emotional response in me. And I think that's the power of this. It's one thing to know that there were black people here thousands of years ago and to know that white people weren't always white, but to see...
There weren't just black people. There's no evidence that there were white people.
No, but we know that there were Africans here before there were English people here, for example. And so through that gives you a sense of the idea that there's this indigenous British person who is white and essentially British is a fiction, you know, it's a narrative that was created over time. It's not based on scientific facts. So this is another feature of that, really. But still, I think to see it, it does connect you with that history in a new way.
I mean, does this make a mockery of the whole idea of race?
In terms of the idea that race is a social construct, yeah, it absolutely does. Because if your idea is that the way that you look is the way that you are, if your body and your physical appearance code for things beyond that physical appearance, things like your behaviour and your character, then it certainly does. Because up until relatively recently, this person looked very different from how a lot of people imagined that he did.
But at the same time, I mean, we know race is a social construct, but the fact that this story is provoking such a reaction, that people are talking about it so much, it just goes to show how deeply entrenched our concepts of race and our preconceptions are, because I think everyone's quite surprised.
But I mean, a lot of the reaction has been, ha, 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 this is going to be a nightmare for the racists, you know, what are they going to do? But I mean, has it challenged at all your own sense of who you are? Do you feel any more British tonight?
I think there is still a very real sense in this country that to be British is somehow to be white, that Britishness is essentially white, and the less white you are, the less British you are. And I think, you know, as a mixed-race woman growing up in this country, I think I would have had a different sense about how white Britishness is if I'd have known that original British people 10,000 years ago looked like this.
I mean, a lot of us who are British also slightly feel like outsiders because of race.
I should tell you that I'm an immigrant, so I know that I'm British because I paid for, took the test, passed, been naturalised, and made an affirmation to the Queen. So I've got the paperwork to demonstrate how British I am. But of course we feel like outsiders if every single history documentary and if every single box set that you're watching about the history of Roman Britain or about the history of Edwardian Britain shows only white people. Of course we're going to feel like outsiders. We can't feel like we're reflected in the stories we've been telling.
So the question is, does this change anything? Does this change anything about the way Britain feels racially and the arguments that will go on?
I think the arguments, because this is a scientific argument being put forward, science isn't going to stop racists from being racist. Already someone has said, well, maybe he was visiting. How are you going to prove that it wasn't? And that's a fair scientific critique.
He was an overstayer. I think there are two things. I think on the one hand is this concept of race being constructed and having changed over time. But the second thing is immigration. We do not have a sense of being an immigrant nation, even though that is essentially what we are. And I think this is very useful in reminding people that we are an immigrant nation. Everybody came here from somewhere. And actually, they're saying that only 10% of the current British population is descended from Cheddar Man. So most British people are more recent immigrants than him. And I think that is really helpful in changing our narrative about what immigration means. There would be no British population if it weren't for immigration. And it's hard to understand that you could be so hostile to immigration as an intrinsic principle. I think there are people in Britain who feel like that, if you understand that everyone's ancestors were immigrants at some point.
But how does it help you or otherwise in those conversations about indigenous Britons? You know, which is an argument that you often have around immigration and racism. You know, there are people out there who think indigenous Britons are white.
And I think it's that much harder to think that now. And, you know,
I mean, they also think Jesus was white.
It was already, well, none of this was ever based on fact, but the more evidence you have and the more visual and emotional that evidence's impact is, I think the harder it is for people to sustain those myths. And I know there are people who will still sustain them, but I think they'll have to be an increasingly irrational minority. We don't laugh at racists in the way that we should. I mean, in terms of a scientific argument, we laugh at creationists. If someone said the world was created in 4004 BC on Wednesday the 31st, therefore the Earth is a Libra, because that's what, if you read biblical scholars, that's when the Earth was created. We laugh at them. You guys are laughing at me when I'm saying that. If there are people who are bringing, and if scientists continue to look at the idea of race as a scientific construct, it's great. Any geneticist worth their salt will tell you there is no such thing as race. If you take two people of African descent, there is going to be greater genetic variance between those two people than there will be between one of them and someone who is European, racialized as white. We know that. We say that a lot. But that doesn't begin to help us understand why we're talking about race in the first place. So there's not any point in scientists doing good work saying race doesn't exist if the question then becomes, well, why are we talking about it? Because race is a social reality, you know, and it's got no grounding in scientific fact, but it is a social reality that we all live, you know, whether we're white or from an ethnic minority background, we all live a racialized experience. And so this kind of problematizes that because the categories of white, indigenous and immigrant just stop making sense. And I think that's really useful.
We must leave it there. Afua Hirsch Sabajazas, thank you very much. Indeed, we didn't have time to get on to lactose intolerance.
It's very sad for Cheddar Man.
Indeed. Matt. Thanks, Chris.
I've been